Okay, so I knew there'd be a crowd, so that's why we moved it in the hall, and so this is good. And I guess the next project is to knock out some walls here to make room for a big space. But anyway, that'll be next week's project. And here comes one more right there. Usually we go around the room and tell everybody who we are, but we got too many right now. So you're welcome to stay afterward and visit with Joel and tell him who and whose you are, because where we're from, it don't matter who you are. It's whose you are. And who you got in the graveyard. Try to have a seat.
Down there?
Oh, you can sit right here. That's the last one in the house.
We saved it for you.
You'll be just fine. Just don't back down to the steps.
Oh, right.
But anyway, there's some of you in this room who love Joel Hancock almost as much as I do. And there's one who probably loves him a little bit better, and that would be Miss Leah, number four. Number 4 of the fourth girl at the Hancock clan. But Joel and I go way back, and our trails have intersected in many places. Most of all in telling the story of Shackleford Banks. And I jumped all over somebody when they walked in this morning and said Shack. So let's get this straight. Back me up here. There ain't no such place as Shack, and there's no such place as Harkers. Now, if you want to come here and you want to be a part of the community, then get it right. And that's just the way it is. Now, right? Did I hear amen? I mean, that's Kurt. Tell me.
Preach it.
Preach it. So anyway, so we got that straight. So he's going to talk to you about Shackleford Banks and the migration to the Promised Land and the Salt Path and our beloved Harkers Island. So if you can't hear Joel, holler, scream, whatever. This is not perfect acoustics, but it's a great place to spend a July afternoon on his birthday. Happy birthday! How old are you now? 70, that's
I'm
right.
the age that old people used to be.
That's right, I knew that. But anyway, happy birthday, Joel Hancock. And in our world, he's not really Joel, he's Charlie Williams for you. That's right?
You ready?
I'm ready if you are.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone. I'm really flattered by this group. It was wonderful.
We paid them all.
I hope that you're not disappointed. I called Karen yesterday to make sure, what the protocols were. In the post-COVID world, you can't take anything for granted about how things were going. And so I called her and she told me to sit in, and she talked to me about how the presentation might go, and said that we'll start with somewhat of a narrative. We'll have some questions, but please feel free to ask questions all along if there's something that's not clear, or if you'd like to add to it. I don't hear very well. Karen has agreed to be my translator, especially in the COVID world when people had their face mask on. I was really at a loss. I could not see their lips. So bear with me with that, and together we'll get it done. But again, because of how things might have changed yesterday after we had discussion, she left. I called her back, and the last thing I would ask her, I said, Karen, what should I wear? And she, without wavering at all, she said, don't make a difference, it won't be nobody me and you. As Karen mentioned, I'm talking really about leaving the banks. But I got to put it in proper perspective. I want to talk about how they got there in the first place. And rather than trying to give you a narrative, detailed, symmetrical story, I'm going to tell about some of my personal impressions and about some of the people that left, hoping that you'll be able to, or others may be able to fill in the blanks, but I'm going to try to give some outline before doing that. Did not grow up with this knowledge, but it seemed, in learning it later on, it seemed to be almost self-evident that North Carolina had very few people that came directly from England. The ports, Wilmington was late in coming, and the ports along the Outer Banks just did not offer themselves to large transports of people or other things. And so North Carolina, the inland was settled, largely from people coming down the road from Pennsylvania and Virginia and down the Appalachian Spine. But the Outer Banks, or excuse me, all of eastern North Carolina was settled mostly in two ways. One, people coming up from Charleston. They came up through the Wilmington area and mostly all the way up to around Onslow County. But northeastern North Carolina is almost entirely, and it stayed that way until really World War II, was settled almost entirely by people making their way down from the Tidewater area of Virginia. Most of you, if your names are native to eastern North Carolina, you can find them on the records of Tidewater. Many of them, I would guess most of them came as workers or even as indentured servants working for the landed aristocracy that established itself in Tidewater. And they fell upon a lot of hard times after 1619, which was really less than 20 years after the first settlement, when African slaves were brought in to do the labor that they had been brought over to do. Some of them, as I said, forced over to do. And they very soon grew tired of being under the control of that landed aristocracy. And some of them ran away, and some of them just moved when they got their freedom down into North Carolina, in the Dismal Swamp area, into that area. But a large group of them worked down the Outer Banks of Corolla all the way down. This would start in the 1650s. By the early 1800s, they had made their way down to Cape Lookout, the end, what we call the end of the Outer Banks, the lower Outer Banks. And there you will find that the names there are basically the same as all the way up the Outer Banks to Dare County. There's a whole lot of the same family names. Whereas from Onslow County south, there's very few of the same family names. Well, when they got there, they were very much taken in by the idea of something that had been introduced at almost the same time by some Yankee entrepreneurs that had arrived in Beaufort. There were 5 families of them. There was the Piggotts, the Chadwicks, the Whitehursts, the Leffers, and the Harkers. They came down to take advantage of what they had learned in the Yankee whaling industry. But unlike the whalers of the Massachusetts area, the ones that you would read about in Moby Dick and stuff, where they were gone for months and even years at a time, the whalers here were shore-based. The whales making their way up through Onslow Bay would come close to shore and they could be sighted from land. And it became a very profitable business for them. And that whaling industry would be the main source of hard currency for the next 200 years. Well, not that long. I'll give you some more definitive date then. But it would be now they sustained themselves out of the water and with hunting and other things. But whaling would be how they would make their money. One of those whalers, as I mentioned, was named Ebenezer Harkins. And in 1730, he purchased an island between Beaufort and Core and Shackleford Banks called Craney Island. And he purchased it from a guy named George Pollock, as in Pollock Street in Beaufort. And he changed the name of it very quickly to his name of Harkers Island. And he didn't put an apostrophe there. I've heard, they said, because it wasn't, Harkers was not, the S was not meant to show possession, it was meant to show plurality. He bought enough land for his children and grandchildren, he thought, to last forever. And it did for a while, but unlike the Leffers and the Whitehursts and the Chadwicks and Piggotts, the Harker had very few Y chromosomes, especially in the second and third generation. So eventually, the only remnant of his name having been here would be the name of the island. Now, he is my great-grandfather 7 times removed. In fact, let me read you a little bit of a story about that. The descendants of at least one of my forefathers followed a different course rather than coming down the Outer Banks. Anthony Harker was born in 1606 in Sibsey in Lincolnshire, which is in northeastern, by Leeds in England. By that time, he was 30 years old. He was married, living in Boston, where he and his wife Mary raised a family of 2 sons and 4 daughters. Their third child, John Ebenezer, remained in Boston area and in 1680 married Patience Folger, whose sister, Abia Folger, would become the mother of the renowned Benjamin Franklin, making their children would be cousins, including their Anthony Harker's, or John Harker's second son, Ebenezer, born in 1689. Now, because of primogeniture in the New England colonies, the oldest son got everything, and so the youngest son had to find another way to make a living. He got in the whaling industry and joined with the others that came down to Carteret County. In 1730, when he was 41 years old, he purchased the land for George Pollock. It cost him 400 pounds and a 20-foot boat. And he married a girl from Straits named Elizabeth Brooks, and he had 6 children. As I said, it had earlier been called Craney Island, but he changed it Harkers Island. By 1890, when our story basically begins, there were still less than 100 people on Harkers Island, and almost all of them direct descendants of Ebenezer Harker, even though most of them did not carry the Harker name by then. But at Diamond City, where the people in Shackleford Banks were congregating mostly at Diamond City, I've got a map that my father drew. I thought I would bring a copy of that. You can't see this, but my father did this when he was 80 years old, and it shows how Shackleford Banks was divided, and it shows up here at what would later become Bard's Inlet. He called it the ditch before the storm of 1933, and Diamond City, and then that was where the Hancock family was, and then Bell's Island, where my mama, he says Marguerite's ancestors, and he's got like the dipping for cattle, Whale Creek Bay, Sam Windsor's Wade Shore, the Mullet Pond, and things like that on there. But most of the people there would be at Diamond City. But something happened around 1880 in Pennsylvania that really affected this area, and that was the discovery of crude oil. And within less than a generation, crude oil had replaced whale oil. And then in terms of firing, being used for power. And so the whaling industry really suffered after that. Although in 1898, a Mormon missionary was proselyting at Harkers Island when he received word that a whale had been beached on Shackleford's side. And he would describe in great detail how they harvested that whale and some very interesting facts and stuff about that. Recently I read a book by David McCullough, who's been one of the famous historians, popular historians of late, about the Wright brothers. And he has a couple of wonderful chapters in there about Kitty Hawk when Wilbur Wright was there and before Orville came down. And here's how he described Kitty Hawk. And I think if you were to close your eyes, you can imagine Diamond City and Shackleford Banks would have been about the same. He says, the scene from the tent door, this is Wilbur writing, the scene from almost any point was spectacular, with great stretches of water and sand dunes and beach and tremendous sky overhead, with cumulus clouds rising like castles thrilling to behold against the blue. Long, flat horizons reached far in the distance in every direction. Get this now. And then there was the wind. Always the wind. It was not just that it blew nearly all the time. It was the same force that had sculpted the sand hills and great dunes of Kitty Hawk that shaped and kept shaping the whole surrounding landscape. If you've been on Harkers Island or any of the places, the wind, when this summer comes and these hot days, the land heats faster than the water, and so the air rises and it sucks the air off of the sand or off the ocean. And so no matter how calm or calm it is in the morning, by mid-afternoon and until way after supper, it's blowing almost gale force winds. When my brother moved back from the state of Washington and got on the south shore of the island, he said he had forgotten that you can't have lawn chairs. Anything that's not tied down. The first exodus really began in the 1880s when John Motley Moorhead's crew decided they wanted to build a port here to compete with Wilmington. He had some political opponents that were based in Wilmington, and he decided he was going to in-run them and build a port here in Morehead City. And he needed workers, and on the Outer Banks there was not nearly the number of former slaves that there had been in the rest of North Carolina. And so he recruited his workers from off of the banks. Now, if Elida were here, I thought about Karen and make this. If Elida were here, you could just have her speak every Thursday.
Every Thursday.
But anyway, Elida would tell you about how they got their name from, and Barbara here probably knows this better than me and probably already told this story about it. They said that some of the natives, when they would see them coming, they said that rather come the children of Israel as if they're coming from the promised land. Now, Elida would point out that this promise with no D, maybe just an apostrophe at the end, but it's promised land, not promised land. And Elida would say that as children, sometimes in the turn of the century, they were looked upon skeptically, still looked upon skeptically by the natives of Morehead City. But they moved to the Shepherd's Point area and basically had been there, some descendants, given Barbara and others, there ever since. That started in the 1880s, continued in the 1890s. But the mass exodus from the banks, an exodus that within 5 years would leave it almost totally barren. By the way, Keith Willis posted today a map of Shackleford Banks from the 1850s showing all of the vegetation that was there. All of that changed between 1896 and 1899. For a storm in 1896 gave a portent of what would come 3 years later in 1899. This is how my Aunt Lillian Davis, born in 1910, would describe it in her history of Shackleford Banks. She said, the wind blew from the northeast at first and brought in tides from the south. This would be in August of 1899. Then, by the way, knowing that, northeast, that meant probably followed something like what Florence followed. It would be offshore if we were getting that northeast breeze in here. Then followed hours after that, all was perfectly calm for a while. The eye of the storm. Suddenly the wind shifted to the southwest and again blew as hard or harder than before. So now the storm's up there and offshore, so that southwester has come blowing. With the southwest winds came the waters from the ocean, and the two waters met. This time, few if any homes were without water in them. Even the giant sand dune that ran through the center of the town had almost been washed away. My daddy could remember that. It's called the Yellow Hill. He was born in 1909. There's still, Kurt, you probably remember, there was that big hill back of the horse pen, even when we were little, but eventually after Hurricane Donna, it pretty much was gone. To add insult to the already intolerable injury, the waters had uncovered graves at the local cemetery and left bones and caskets thrown everywhere. The only cemetery that escaped was the one at Wade Shore, the one that's still there, and that's called Wade Shore, is much higher. The cemetery is up in the hills there. But at Diamond City, they were washed up. For most of the inhabitants, the choice to go was pretty obvious. You had the Promised Landers who had already begun leaving, and then you had a group of 29 families at the west end of the banks, what Daddy called the Mullet Pond, who just moved down the banks to a place called Gillikin, and which soon took the name of Salter Path. Now, I had the experience when I first came back to Harkers Island out of college of being the tax collector in Beaufort. At the time that the Salter Path squatters finally got deed to the land. That was in 1978 and 79. The tax supervisor at the time was Ronnie Smith from Salter Path. So we had a Harkers Islander and a Salter Path that were handling that. Some of you may know that, but by 1978, there was only one of the original squatters left. And you had to claim the land, you had to show you were a literal descendant of one of those 29 squatters that had been donated the land by Alice Hoffman, or had been given the land by Alice Hoffman. That's a whole other story. But I used to hitchhike from East Carolina when I was in college on Fridays, especially my freshman and sophomore year, I wanted to come home every weekend. And I got with a group, and it was Neil Smith from Salter Path, and it was Cliff Mason from the Promised Land, and me. So we had three of these And Cliff would say that the Promised Land is really the oldest son, oldest child, so they're the true heirs to the Shackleford Banks tradition. Now, but Neil would say no. When the truest one would be Salter Path, because they moved down the banks and didn't marry nobody else but each other for 2 generations. I say, well, no, but the real heirs are Harkers Island, because that's where about 80% of them moved. And even though we married into the Harker family that was there, and we were the ones that could still see Diamond City out of our windows on the South Shore all the time. Now, my cousin Charles Davis, he's a PhD in chemistry out of Chapel Hill, but he wrote a book a dozen or so years ago called The Island. I don't know if any of you've read that or seen that. And he is a literal descendant also of Ebenezer Harker, and he feels like that what he calls the Shackleford Willises came and overran his ancestors, and in his opinion sort of ruined the island when they came. But when they came, it was it was not a gradual one. The storm of 1899, by the end of 1900, there was the Mormon missionaries who came and recorded what they saw there at the end of 1900 said they found less than a dozen houses there. Can you imagine that? Where there had been almost 1,000 people living all along the banks in 1896 and up to 1899. Now there was less than a dozen houses. I think about when I read this recently. I was reading some of John Steinbeck's the Grapes of Wrath, and he said that the Joad family left everything behind them as they pulled up stakes and headed west for the fields of California. And I was relating that to those people leaving the banks. As the family looks back and behind them at their homes and farms they were leaving in the Dust Bowl of the Depression-era Oklahoma, Tom, or if we was at Niger, we'd call it Henry Fonda, asked himself, how can we live without our lives? How will we know it's us without our past? In a very real sense, though, the people that left the banks, either for Promised Land or for Salter Path, they didn't leave it behind, especially the ones from Harkers Island. Even in my youth, 50 years later, going to the banks was as much as part of the routine as going to Shell Point. It was done all the time, and it was considered in ways to be our own. When the crowd from the banks began arriving at the island, again, I'm telling this mostly from the point of view of somebody who came to the island rather than the other places. Some as early as the fall of 1896, they usually found a place close to family already living on the island. There had been a lot of intermarriage between. For example, my grandfather, Charlie, when he arrived on Christmas Day of 1900, built his house directly beside where his mother-in-law, my great-grandmother, Emmeline Brooks, a descendant of Ebenezer Harker, had been established for almost 20 years. If anything, the exodus from the banks allowed families that had been spread out by 150 years of mingling on the banks, they joined back together when they got to the island. But within just a few years, patterns of settlement and resettlement were established that would last for more than half a century. Now I want to tell you give you a couple stories, then I'm going to talk about that bond of settlement, what census takers would find when they came to the island, starting in 1910. The first generation that left the banks did so grudgingly at best. They retained their memories and attachments and even their longings. No one I ever knew personally ever missed it longer than did Mary Willis. Everybody called her Aunt Mary, and I guess she was an aunt to a lot of people, but no one ever called her anything other than Aunt Mary. She was born in 1885, so she would have been a mid-teenager when they left, and she died in 1987. But the story is told that in 1970, her son, Willie Guyan, finally took her back. She had never been back to the banks from the day she left. She said at first she wanted to, but there was no reason for anyone to take her. And eventually her life was on this side of it. She had children and other things. Finally, in 1970, 70 years after she left, her son, Willie Guyan, puts her in one of those Harkers Island open boats and takes her, and the tide was real low. So he stopped the boat and anchored it right off of Bell's Island. and they got in a skiff and oared through the marshes up toward Bell's Island where she was growing up. And it is said that as they're going through the marshes, she stood up and took a deep breath and said, "Hon, don't that horse piss smell good?" I don't know if any of you've ever had, but where my children are gone, they know they're home when they get to the North River Bridge, put the windows down, and smell the marshes. That is the truest indicator, no matter what time of day or night. Smelling, and can you imagine what it would be like to smell that after 70 years? From November to February, when the wind turns to the northern, if you've got a whole island of trees between you and the wind, it helps a great deal. Plus, they could work the banks. Now, this is a personal observation I made, and it says, "And in a remarkable testament to the familial bond shared by the newcomers to the island and their Harkers descendants who were there, the shoreline would remain entirely communal for another 70 years. Now, get that. No one claimed the shoreline. The shoreline belonged to everybody. Regardless of who or what lay up above the tide line, it was understood that the sandy beach and the water that adjoined it belonged to everyone equally. Other than a series of breakwaters that were laid to prevent erosion after the hurricanes of the 1950s, there were no artificial barriers to block access to or passage through the shoreline in any direction. No matter how far his home might be inland from the water, every fisherman, along with his family and crew, had an easement, an accepted easement, along paths and even through yards of his neighborhoods that allowed unfettered access to his boats, skiffs, nets, and gear. All day long, people would walk on the path beside my house, going to the landing on the shore where my granddaddy's house had been, because once you got to the shore, it belonged to everybody. If you needed to clean off the bottom of your boat, you pulled them up on the shore, regardless of whose house was there. Boats were anchored, moored, or tied in places that were the most convenient and not just necessarily adjacent to the property of their owners. And because there were no fences or barricades, the shore itself was a convenient pathway headed both east and west. As long as I can remember as a boy, the shortest distance between any 2 points was not a straight line. It was along the shore. That was the fastest way to get from one place to another. It was on close to the shore landing that most of the islanders made their homes in what template, and that template had not changed by the time I came along. Looking back, the world I grew up with, the building pattern from one end of the island to the other could be described as a series of conjoining circles that in one way or another were connected to every other circle on the island. Everybody was related to the person next to them. Maybe not to the one next to them, but everybody lived in a neighborhood of people that they were related to. From Shell Point at the east to Rush Point at the west, the entire community was divided into neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods were divided in families. Now I've got Kurt here. Kurt, can you give me a witness to this? Moving east to west, it began with the Yeomanses at the eastern and extended all the way to the Brookses at the western. Now in between were the Roses, the Gaskells, the Lewises, the Joneses, the Ways, the Nelsons, the Brookses, the Chadwicks, the Fulchers, the Davises, the Fulforts, the Johnsons, the Scotts, the Gillikins, the Lawrence, the Hamiltons, the Dixons, the Starnes, the Moores, and the Hancocks, and some others in between. Now, in between these clusters were Guthries and Willises, and especially the latter. The Willises, most of whom had come from the Banks, were so numerous that they were represented in every neighborhood and every family. What Charles would say, those damn Shackleford Willises. They took over the place. But Kurt, as I said, couldn't you picture the family names in every one of those places? Therefore, much more so than for my children or my grandchildren, mine was a generation that grew up surrounded by our past. There was no need to have a celebration or a reunion, even a bulletin board of pictures or charts. We were surrounded by it all the time. It stared us in our faces, and we couldn't ignore it. The only way to get away was to run away, and nobody wanted to do that. I've heard it said it was like the old baseball games that the results were never recorded because everybody had been at the game when it was played. And that's sort of how it was living on the island. Everybody knew everything that was happening. Now I'm going to give you some examples. Now, as I say these names, those of you who grew up with me on the island will recognize will place a face with every name that I'm going to say here. For example, every day we were confronted with an expression like this: take this to old Pa's house. Now there was an old Pa in every family, right here. But if I knew, I knew he was talking about Charlie Hancock's house. You can find it on Aunt Gracie's porch, or you play games in Rennie's field. Somebody could be broke down at the end of Ferry Dock Road, or he rode his bike all the way to Shell Point. We were swimming at Danke's dock, or Henry's dock, or someone else's dock, and we played baseball in Johnson's cow pasture. We walked and rode bikes on the old road, and we pulled tin cans in the middle of the new road. Every time we went to the landing, we looked across to Bell's Island, Whale Creek Bay, Wade Shore, Sam Windsor's Lump, the Horse Pen, or Whitehorse's Island. Every time we crossed the bridge, we noticed a lump of cedar trees on the very edge of what we call Brown's Island, and we stared in the other direction at the vines of Harkers Point. But it wasn't just places. A tall man was longer than Lonzo Lewis. A large man was bigger than Bull Hunter. Smarter than Charlie Nelson, could oar faster than Luther Willis, told more lies than Lying Willie. Could throw a baseball harder than Mo Willis, play and sing like the Rose Crowd. Loved loon more than Lope, or could run faster than Billy Hancock. The ultimate question that I was asked as a young boy, I grew up with 4 nieces and nephews that were older than me. And especially my nephew Jonathan, who was 5 years older than me, was sort of like my childhood hero. I was around all the time. And so when I was becoming the peer pressure, like was as real then as it is now, the ultimate question my mother would ask me would be this: if Jonathan jumped off the lighthouse, would that mean that you had to jump off the lighthouse too?
Hey, he would.
Or especially the bridge. Most of us had 2 names because everyone was named after someone else, right, Chris Guy? You couldn't say that something happened or belonged to Mary or Murray. It had to be more specific. Was it Mary Ann, Mary Frances, Mary Catherine, or Norman's Mary, Weldon's Mary, Tommy Lewis's Mary, or Edie's Mary? Boys were the same. It could be Johnny Lane, Johnny Wayne, Johnny Michael, Johnny Manley, the son of Johnny Boo, or Johnny Van, the son of Alenus's Johnny. If Mama sent me to get something from Ollie, she had to be more specific. Was it Big Ollie or Little Ollie? Everyone was part of a crowd, and that meant more than your last name. I grew up in a neighborhood where I was part of Charlie Hancock's crowd. 6 days a week, 7 days a week, I was part of Bertha Willis's crowd when we were at church. I worked at the High Tide Boat Works in Williston with my daddy, Julian Guthrie's place, which, by the way, is where Jarrett Bay began, because it was on Jarrett Bay. And one of the workers there was named Danny Boy. Do you remember Danny Boy? And he would eat BC as if it were sugar all the time. He would say, young man, talking to any of the boys there, go get me a BC. I'll pay you when you get back. Well, the last day I was there one summer, I said, Danny, well, I'm been here with you all summer. You don't even know my name. He said, yes, I do. I said, well, what's my name? He said, you're that boy, Charlie Hancock. When the crowd left the banks, they assembled as families. Census takers for the next 50 years were given the appearance, when they looked at their book, as if they were sorted by some key field in the census taker's handbook. Instead, they were merely listing the names in the order they found them. One extended family, or more especially one crowd after another. I was born in 52, but I can look at the 1930 or the 1940 or now the 1950 census. and see the exact world that I grew up in, just in a line coming from the western to the eastern. In fact, my brother Tommy, who passed away, that was one of the things he loved to do, was go back and look at those names, and then he would conjure up a story and could tell a story about everyone there. Everybody was part of a crowd. Promised Landers were first called the crowd from the banks when they came here. Salter Pathers, even today, are lumped together as the crowd of Salter Pathers. And I got to close with a story about one of my visits to a dentist. A new dentist in town had a dental technician who was new to the area, had only been here a few months. And so I went in to get my teeth cleaned, and as I began, I introduced myself and listened. I said, "No, I apologize, but I grew up in a world where there was no such thing as preventive dentistry. The only time you went to the dentist was if you had a bad enough tooth that they had to extract a tooth. So if you look on my mouth, you're going to find one hollow spot on each side there. And I can still remember the pain that was involved in that. But she said, "Don't you worry. You won't see that crowd of Harkers Island come in here." So I said, I told you, I am a Harker. So anyway, she didn't mean it as a compliment, but I still take it as such. We're told that the horses are the descendants of Spanish conquistadors that wrecked and stuff on that. And in our youth, there were not just horses there, but there were cattle and sheep, goats, and even wild boars and stuff that would be at time. Now before we talk about the penny, let me ask if there's anybody knows this. I don't know. So I have never, in all of my research, and Josiah Bailey's research and others, have never found where a horse was used for draft, for plowing, for anything. They were just wild horses. In fact, my Uncle Louis would tell stories that when they would catch fish on the ocean side and put them in sacks, and then put those sacks on their back and walk across to the eastern side to what called Whale Creek Bay, where they could put them in a boat and take them to Beaufort. And horses would get in their way. And I wondered, did it never cross their mind to put that on the horse's back? That's what my daddy used to say, every generation gets weaker and wiser. But that in mind, the horse penning was done they were not corralled or rounded up with horses. A bunch of boys from the island were always recruited the days before the July the 4th. Some would be put out at the Mullen Pond and some at Bard's Inlet or out there. And they would run them together toward Diamond City. I mean, the boys would run and just herd the horses on foot. Now, that lasted, Kurt, until the mid-60s, at least the 70s. We've got videos and stuff of it, and there would be 100 boats in what's called Banks Bay, which would be it was the gathering place. Now, two personal stories. One, when I was there, my father I still have the brand that my father used. He had 3 horses when I was a boy over there. And I've got the H brand there. I'm going to get the list someday. But I got too close to a horse, and the horse kicked me right in the chest. And they took me to see Dr. Folger. And I've still got sort of a bump in my chest where that bone was broken. But my favorite story about it is about Donald, what we call Red-Headed Donald. Donald Guthrie on the island. Do you remember Donald?
Oh yeah, Red Donald.
Donald loved to run. I mean, he loved to run horses. He loved to run sheep and stuff. And they said that when he got drafted into World War II, that before they were sent to Europe, the last thing that they had to do in boot camp was to go on a 20-mile hike to see that they could withstand that. And they said 10 miles in, the drill sergeant stopped them for a rest. And said that Donald went up to him sort of like this and said, "We ain't get nowhere if you stop every 10 miles." But Dallas Daniel told me that once they had some sheep up at Drum Inlet, which is the northern core banks. They wanted to move the Cape Lookout where they had a pen. And so they put Donald out to run the sheep with the promise that somebody would meet him at Davis's Island to rest him, to replace him. He said that Donald had a new pair of what we call claw shoes, or to wear so he could run through the marsh and stuff. So Donald got there and took off after the sheep and could go faster than the sailboat that was beside him, sail skiff, He beat them, so when they got to Davis's Island, he was already past them. So when they got to Cape Lookout, they said they looked up, and there was Donald. The sheep were in the pen. Donald was sitting on the side, and on his feet were nothing but shoestrings. where he'd run them off. But that horse penning was sort of a gathering, and it was followed at Harkers Island. And that was done in the morning, and in the afternoon we had boat races at Academy Field, where they would it was at Harkers Island. It only mattered the only thing about speed was you wanted to go faster than the other boat. So on Saturdays when my daddy would go to town, on the way home from the town was just one boat race after another. Now my father would never participate. He would literally just go long enough to just get almost on the edge of the sea. And so boats were going by us all the time. But I saw lots and stuff of boat races there. By the way, the herd now is what is limited to 115 horses. One 4th of July, I went to Billy's to get some stuff, and Manley Gaskell was there, and his son Brent asked my son Mike, he said, Mike, what cape are you going to today? it was assumed we'd be over there. Now, the oldest house on the island is Tom Lewis's house. Again, right up there beside you, right behind Fanny.
Right behind Fanny.
Yeah. We're talking about a place called Red Hill on the island. It's a hill that's almost 20 feet high. But can you imagine how inviting that was to people who had been flooded twice in 5 years? And so that's where Tom Lewis, and that's where the people first gathered, would be at Red Hill, and then spread out. The reason why it was called Red Hill was because when you were at the banks looking toward the island in the summer sun, it was the high hill that the sand, you remember, would glow almost red, the sun bouncing off of it. So you just can't see that anymore because it's been replaced by bulkheads and stuff there. But yes, there were the houses. Now that happened. That was not uncommon because, Barbara, if I'm correct, in Promised Landers also brought houses with them, didn't they? Yep, brought houses and stuff. Now the parts of houses were sometimes just dismantled and then rebuilt or reassembled on the side. But some of them were put on two skies, or
Doris.
Yeah, dories, and put across, and they actually were able to put it on. Of course, the house was probably only like 16 by 12 or at the biggest. I grew up in a house that was 26 by 24, and there were 10 of us that were raised, and that's the size of my den now. 26 by 24, that my mom raised 10 children. When I was in the insurance business after Hurricane Isabel in 2003, that some of you may remember, there was massive flooding in South River as there had been in the storm of 33. And I was down there with an adjuster, and he would ask this man that the house had been built in 1935, 2 years after a massive flood had actually taken lives in South River when the Neuse River overflowed in there. And he asked him, why 2 years after that would you build the house only one block off the ground? And he said, son, you get a flood every generation. It gets cold every winter. And what he was talking about, they built it that way so that the wind wouldn't blow up. And he said, by the way, when the flood came, when it left, you swept it out and everything was just like it was before. Because there was, no sheetrock, no insulation, no electrical wiring, no flooring. There was no subfloor. There was just a floor, and it dried out. So yeah, the flooding meant something different. It was still terrible, but it meant something different to them. By 1960, my daddy never had a car until I was in college. Now my brothers and sisters had cars and would take people to town, and I'll get back to that and say, but also Seashore Bus Line ran a bus to the island in the morning that would pick up around 10 o'clock and then would come back at 2 o'clock and then at 6 o'clock.
Did they come
over to Harkers Island Bridge, but
Front
before
Street?
that,
Okay.
but when we say town, that was Beaufort. The Beaufort waterfront in my youth would be 6 and 8 and sometimes 10 boats deep on a Saturday morning. Just each one lashed to the one between it. I remember being somewhat frightened as my father would hold me in his arm and jump from gunnel to gunnel to gunnel, to get to the, and then eventually when other boats would leave, he would get it up to the side and then let my mama get off there. But I think about that now, how I did, and I used to do somewhat the same thing but now when I go to a basketball game, I have to find someone I know so I can walk up the bleachers beside them to put my hand on their shoulder. But let me just mention, do any of you remember Harkers Lodge on the island?
I do.
That was not from the Harkers. That was from a Harker from Newbern, as far as that. I always thought that had been related to, but it was not from the original Harkers. There are none of the original Harkers carrying that surname on the island now. Now let me mention about the surnames, and I'll mention that because I know we've stayed a little bit over here. All of those names that I told you, everybody in my class was basically that way in the 1958 when I started school. But it would have always been that way for my older brothers and sisters until World War II. In World War II, soldiers and sailors were stationed at Cape Lookout and up in Atlantic and all at Fort Macon and other places. And many of them came to Harkers Island because we had a theater, or a show house as we called it, that showed on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights. And many of them found social acceptance among the girls on the island. Some of the girls left with them after they got married and moved back, and some of them stayed here even after they'd been married, some of that, but with names that were different from the ones that I mentioned. Like
As Denny.
Boudreaux.
Boudreaux, as Denny.
Yeah.
Or as Denny.
Butch, you remember Billy Beeman?
Mm-hmm.
Butch Craver. One of the Aaron Moore and Willie Guthrie married sisters. Well, now Aaron and Annie married Willie Carey's brothers. Anyway, they live right across from each other. Two of their sons went in the army, and 4 of their daughters married soldiers and sailors on the island during World War II. So that basically changed those. That would be the first of having surnames other than, by the way, when I read those surnames, you'll notice those were not really Scotch-Irish. Those were pure, well, I guess British, but you could say Guthrie is the only one that has a Scottish base, but there were lots of Guthries in the Tidewater, and that's what made it down here. So it was almost, when I do my DNA on Ancestry.com, it shows that like 90% of my ancestors are from Great Britain.
From where?
Right. Now, some people, I'd like to think that I had a bunch of real pretty children, Leah being an example. And I had a friend who said that was because my wife finally bought some new DNA. She was from Green. Let me mention this too. Hot, stand up for a moment there. Hot.
This is my granddaddy.
In 1866, two Scandinavian sailors, went to Wilmington and jumped ship because they met a guy from Harkers Island named Eugene Yeomans. And he invited them to the Harkers Island. One of them was named Charles Clausen, and one was named Louis Larson. Now, Charles came and stayed and met a girl in Beaufort and stayed in Beaufort and started a place called Clausen's Emporium, a dry goods store and stuff. And the Clausen's restaurant that is there today is on that location in the same building as him. So that's why Hot gets to eat there all the time for free, is because he is the great grandson of Charles Clausen. Charles Clausen's mate in jumping ship was named Louis Larson. He was from Norway. He marries a girl, a descendant of Ebenezer Harker, named Emmeline Brooks in 1869. And they immediately had 2 children. He starts a grist mill there, grinding grain from that station. And if you go there now to that Harker's Point, you'll still see that stone there that was there and turned by a windmill. But when my grandmother, his second daughter, was less than a year old, he died. He'd only been here 3 years. And with him died almost everything that to be known about him. So I can trace Charles Clausen all the way back to Sweden. But with those Norwegian names, his name Louis Larson means basically that he was the son of Lars. In Scandinavian nomenclature, they don't give them the last name of their father, they give them the first name of their father. So I knew nothing about him. So I have to gather what I can from a few stories that my great-grandmother told my father when my father was a little boy. And I'll give you again, I promise I'll leave you with this evidence that if you read between the lines, there's stories in almost everything. Her name was Agnes. She knew she was named after her Scandinavian mother. Remember now, her father's name was Louis Larson. 10 years after he died, her mother married Calvin Farr Willis, is one of those Willis families, and moved up to the midpoint of the island and soon had 2 children. That would be David Yeoman's crowd, Claire, yeah, and then Calvin, Neil, Rennie, Esther, Barbara, and all that. So anyway, those would be her half brothers and sisters. But there's some evidence that she didn't feel really at home with her new father. If you look at her family group sheet, she had her first son, remember her father's name, was named Louis. Her second child, a daughter, she named Louisa. Her third child, a girl, she named Lorena. And her fourth child, another daughter, she named Agnes after herself. Can you tell that there was some longing for that father that she had ever known? Well, all of us probably can have stories about that. I know this, that I was told years ago, and what I have found in doing family history research, which is what basically this leads to. There's nobody you wouldn't love if you knew their story. And that's one of the best reasons to do family history work, whether it's just attaching records, identifying graves, or finding pictures. Everything you find out about them helps you to put together their story. And if you know that story, you love them. So thank you very much.